The rain that evening fell like it had a purpose, not the kind that rushed or raged, the kind that lingered, tapping softly against the tall windows of the Haneul estate, as if asking permission to enter. Inside, the mansion hummed with the quiet discipline of power. Footsteps muted, voices low, the air thick with the invisible weight of decisions that shaped lives beyond its gates. Tae-jin Haneul stood at the far end of the grand hall, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit. Even in stillness, he carried the gravity of a man the city whispered about. His presence didn't demand silence. It created it. "Hyung!" Min-jae's voice broke the hush, light but eager. "I brought someone." Tae-jin didn't turn immediately. Min-jae had a habit of collecting strays, stray deals, stray risks, stray people. Most were forgotten within days, but something in his tone tonight lingered. When Tae-jin finally looked over his shoulder, he saw her. A girl, no, a young woman, stood just inside the doorway, rainwater still clinging to the hem of her plain grey dress. She held her hands together as if trying not to take up space, her posture gentle but unyielding, like a reed that bends without breaking. Her eyes were lowered, but not in fear, in stillness. "This is Seo-yeon," Min-jae said. "She needed work. I thought the house could use another pair of hands." Tae-jin's gaze brushed over her the way one scans furniture. Efficient, detached. Nothing about her should have stood out. No defiance, no pleading, no desperation. And yet, there was a faint pull, like a melody remembered only halfway. Something about the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the way her presence didn't ripple the air, but seemed to settle into it. "Does she speak?" Tae-jin asked. Seo-yeon lifted her head slightly. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "Yes, sir." Just 2 words, but they landed strangely, as if he'd heard them before, in a place he couldn't reach. Tae-jin gave a small nod, already turning away. "See that she learns the routine." Min-jae smiled, satisfied, and began explaining duties. But Tae-jin's attention had drifted. Not to her face, not to her voice, but to the faint sensation lingering in his chest. A subtle pressure, like a memory knocking without permission. As he walked down the hall, the sound of her footsteps, light, measured, followed behind the others. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he slowed. Only for a second. Only long enough for the echo of those steps to align with something buried deep inside him. A rhythm he almost recognized. He didn't look back. But that night, as the rain softened into silence, Tae-jin found himself awake long after the house had gone still, listening, without knowing why, for the sound of a stranger moving through his home, and wondering why it felt like she had been there long before she arrived. Morning arrived without warmth. Sunlight spilled across the courtyard of the Haneul estate, but it felt distant, as though the day itself were hesitant to step fully inside. The house stirred awake in quiet precision. Doors opening, porcelain clinking, the faint rustle of uniforms and routine. Seo-yeon moved through the kitchen like a shadow that knew its place. Her hands worked automatically, folding linen, arranging trays, memorizing the rhythm of a life she had only just entered. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival. But something here was different. It wasn't the grandeur or the silence. It was the sound. From the hallway above, a voice carried. Calm, low, unmistakably controlled. "Have the car ready in 10 minutes?" Seo-yeon froze. The tray in her hands tilted slightly, a teacup rattling against its saucer. The sound of his voice, Tae-jin's voice, slipped through her like a draft through a cracked window, stirring something she didn't know was there. A flicker, a child's laughter echoing down a narrow corridor, the faint scent of soap, a hand, larger, warmer, pulling her gently forward. The images vanished before they could form, leaving only the echo behind. Seo-yeon steadied the tray, her breath shallow but controlled. She told herself it was nothing, just the way memories sometimes misfire when you're tired, when your mind reaches for something familiar and finds only shadows. But the feeling lingered. Later, in the courtyard, she knelt to tend a row of flowers she didn't know the names of. The air smelled faintly of earth and rain, grounding her, steadying the quiet unease still humming under her ribs. Footsteps approached behind her, deliberate, unhurried. "You're new." She looked up. Tae-jin stood at the edge of the path, the morning light tracing the sharp lines of his suit. Up close, his presence felt heavier, not threatening but undeniable, like gravity. "Yes, sir," she said. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, studying her with the detached curiosity of a man used to reading people like documents. There was no recognition in his eyes, only the faintest crease of thought, as though he were trying to recall a word just out of reach. "Min-jae says you work quietly," he said. "I try not to disturb anything," she replied. Another flicker, the same sensation from before, only sharper now. His voice wrapped around her thoughts, and suddenly she wasn't in the courtyard anymore. She was running down a hallway, a boy's voice calling her name. Urgent, protective. The feeling of a hand tightening around hers. The vision snapped like a thread pulled too hard. Seo-yeon blinked, the world rushing back into place. Tae-jin was still there, watching her with a faint, unreadable expression. "You're pale," he said. "I'm fine." He nodded once, already turning away, but the silence he left behind felt charged, as if something unspoken had brushed the surface between them and retreated before either could see it clearly. That evening, Seo-yeon lay awake in her small room, the memory fragments replaying in broken loops. Not dreams, not imagination. Something real. And somewhere in the house, beyond walls too thick for sound to carry, Tae-jin paused mid-step in the corridor, struck by a sudden, inexplicable sense of déjà vu. Neither of them knew why, only that something inside their shared silence had begun to stir, like a memory waiting for the right moment to return. The city never slept. It negotiated with the night. From the top floor of the Haneul headquarters, Seoul stretched outward in quiet submission, a mosaic of lights flickering like distant promises. Tae-jin stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling glass, one hand resting lightly against it, as though he could feel the pulse of the streets beneath his fingertips. He had built this empire brick by calculated brick, every alliance measured, every threat eliminated before it could bloom. The world believed his rise had been inevitable, a man born for power. But inevitability is a story people tell when they don't know the cost. A knock sounded behind him. "Enter." The door opened without hesitation. Jang Myung-rok stepped inside, his presence filling the room without noise, like a shadow cast long before the sun rose. He wore the same expression he always did, the calm certainty of a man who never doubted the direction of history. "You've been busy," Myung-rok said, his voice smooth, almost paternal. Tae-jin didn't turn. The docks are stable. The northern routes are secured." "Good." A pause, measured. "Stability is the foundation of power." Tae-jin finally faced him. The older man's gaze held the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything, because everything had already been arranged. It had always been that way. When Tae-jin was younger, too young to remember the details clearly, Myung-rok had appeared like a solution to a problem no one would explain. He provided a home, protection, and purpose. The past became something sealed away, a room whose door remained closed because there was no reason to open it. At least, that's what he had been taught to believe. "You look tired," Myung-rok observed. "I'm not," Tae-jin replied. But there was something in the older man's eyes, a flicker of quiet satisfaction, as if he could see beyond the answer, as if he always could. "You've done well," Myung-rok said, stepping closer. "Everything you have, you earned it." The words sounded reassuring. They always had. Yet tonight, for reasons Tae-jin couldn't name, they felt heavier, like a compliment that carried an unseen weight. Myung-rok's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "Remember, Tae-jin, power is not given. It is shaped." Shaped. The word lingered long after the touch was gone. Later, after the older man left, Tae-jin remained in the office, the silence pressing in around him. He glanced at the city again, but the view felt different now. Not smaller, not less impressive, just distant. As if he were looking at something that had always belonged to someone else first. Downstairs, Seo-yeon passed quietly through the corridor, carrying a stack of freshly folded linens. She paused for a moment, sensing an unfamiliar tension in the air, though she couldn't explain why. Above her, Tae-jin stood motionless, the echo of Myung-rok's words replaying in his mind. Power is shaped. For the first time, the thought surfaced uninvited. What if his life had been shaped long before he understood what it meant? He exhaled slowly, dismissing the idea as quickly as it came. But somewhere deep beneath the certainty he had always carried, something shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible, like a shadow moving just outside the edge of the light. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It started with a mistake, a small one, a tray placed on the wrong table, a glass left half a step out of alignment, the sort of error no one would have noticed in another home. But in Tae-jin's world, precision was a language, and anything that disrupted it sounded louder than a shout. Seo-yeon realized it the moment she saw the untouched tea set sitting where it shouldn't be. She moved quickly, reaching to correct it. But the door behind her opened first. Tae-jin stepped inside. The air shifted instantly, tightening around his presence. He said nothing at first, his gaze taking in the room with that familiar, measuring calm. There was no anger in his expression, only the quiet gravity of a man used to being obeyed before he spoke. "You changed the arrangement," he said. "I thought—" Seo-yeon began, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry." He crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate. She felt his nearness before she saw it, the subtle weight of attention that made the space between them feel smaller. "Don't assume," he said, not unkindly. "Observe." She nodded, lowering her eyes as she reached to move the tray back to its original position. Her sleeve slipped slightly as she lifted it, just enough for the light to catch her wrist. And that's when he saw it. A small crescent-shaped birthmark, faint but unmistakable. The world didn't stop. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed softly. But for Tae-jin, the room tilted. A flash, not a memory, not fully. A child's hand gripping his, the same mark on a smaller wrist, disappearing as someone pulled them apart. A voice calling through smoke, the sound of something breaking that had never been fixed. He blinked, the vision gone as quickly as it came. "Your wrist," he said quietly. Seo-yeon froze, instinctively pulling her sleeve down. It's just a birthmark. Just. The word echoed in his mind, but the certainty in his chest refused to settle. He had seen that mark before, not in photographs, not in the world he remembered, but somewhere deeper, somewhere buried beneath years of carefully constructed silence. "Where did you get it?" he asked, though the question made no sense the moment it left his mouth. "I've always had it," she replied softly. He studied her face then, really studied it, searching for something he couldn't name. There was no deception there, no hidden agenda, only the same quiet composure she always carried, as if she existed in a space untouched by the tension surrounding her. Tae-jin stepped back, the distance feeling suddenly necessary. "Finish your work," he said. His voice was steady, but something beneath it had shifted. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel the unfamiliar tremor of uncertainty. As he left the room, the image of the crescent mark lingered in his thoughts, stirring fragments he had never questioned before. Behind him, Seo-yeon remained still for a long moment, her fingers brushing lightly over the hidden mark beneath her sleeve, as if it had begun to pulse with a memory she couldn't yet reach. Neither of them understood what it meant, only that something long buried had just found its way to the surface, and it was no longer willing to stay forgotten. The rain returned that night, softer than before, but persistent, like a memory that refuses to fade. Tae-jin didn't usually wander the estate after midnight. His life had always been measured, structured, and efficient. But sleep had abandoned him since the moment he saw the crescent mark. It lingered behind his eyes, a quiet insistence he couldn't silence. He walked the corridor without purpose, the faint glow of wall lamps stretching his shadow along polished floors. Somewhere down the hall, he heard the soft creak of an old door, the one leading to the servants' quarters that had long been empty except for one resident, Madame Gyeong-suk. She had worked in the house longer than anyone could remember, her presence fading into the background of years like a photograph left in the sun. Most days, she spoke little, moving slowly, as if time itself rested gently on her shoulders. Tonight, her door was open. She sat by the small window, a kettle steaming faintly beside her, eyes fixed on the rain tracing patterns against the glass. She didn't turn when Tae-jin entered. It was as if she had been expecting him. "You don't walk these halls at night," she said softly. "Neither do you," he replied. A faint smile touched her lips, not amused, just knowing. "You've been searching," she said, "even if you don't know what for." Tae-jin leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've known me since I was brought here." She nodded. "I want to know about that night," he said. The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. For a moment, Gyeong-suk said nothing. The rain filled the silence, tapping steadily like a clock counting down to something inevitable. "It wasn't random," she said at last. The simplicity of the statement struck harder than any dramatic confession could have. "Your parents," her voice faltered, then steadied. "They were kind people, not part of this world. But kindness makes enemies when power is involved." Tae-jin's jaw tightened. "Who?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know everything. Only those men came who knew the house too well. They didn't break in. They walked in." The image formed unbidden in his mind. Doors opening, footsteps echoing, the sense of something inevitable unfolding while a child watched from the edge of understanding. "And after?" he asked. "You were taken," she said. "Not hidden, not abandoned. Taken, as if it had been planned long before that night ever came. A cold stillness settled in his chest. By whom? Gyeong-suk's gaze finally met his. There was sorrow there, deep and unspoken. By someone who believed he was saving you, she said quietly. The room seemed to shrink around him, the weight of the words pressing into the space where certainty had always lived. For years, he had accepted the story he was given. Tragedy, survival, opportunity. But now, the edges of that story felt too clean, too deliberate. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. Why didn't you tell me before? She looked back at the rain. Because children grow into what they're taught. And I didn't know if you wanted to remember, or if remembering would destroy you. Tae-jin stood there, the past rearranging itself in his mind, to pieces shifting into unfamiliar shapes. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. He turned to leave, the corridor suddenly feeling longer than before. Behind him, Gyeong-suk's voice followed, softer than the rain. There was someone else that night, she said. He stopped. A child, she added. I never saw where she went. The word settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Tae-jin didn't turn around, but as he walked away, one thought echoed louder than the storm outside. If there had been another child that night, who had taken her? And why had no one ever spoken of her again? The warning came as a sound no one else noticed. A faint, metallic click. Small, precise, swallowed almost instantly by the chatter of evening preparations. The estate was hosting a private gathering that night, to the kind where powerful men smiled politely while measuring each other's weaknesses beneath the surface. Seo-yeon stood near the edge of the main hall, arranging glasses on a tray. The low hum of conversation wrapped around her, indistinct and distant, like waves against a shore she had learned never to approach. She kept her movements small, invisible, just another part of the room's rhythm. But something shifted, not outside, inside. A ripple of unease ran through her, the same quiet instinct that had kept her safe in places far less forgiving than this. She paused, her fingers hovering over the tray, listening, not to voices, but to the silence between them. Across the room, Tae-jin felt it too. He had spent his life reading danger the way others read expressions, the slight change in posture, the subtle tightening of a jaw. Tonight, as the air carried a tension that didn't belong to the polite exchanges filling the hall, his gaze swept the room once, sharp and measured. That's when he saw it. A man near the far wall, standing just a fraction too still. His hand dipped inside his jacket, not hurried, not obvious, but deliberate. Time slowed. The distance between the man and Seo-yeon, standing unaware, her back half turned, closed in Tae-jin's mind like a calculation he didn't need to finish. He moved before the thought was complete. The tray slipped from her hands as he reached her, the crash of glass shattering against marble echoing through the hall. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. His arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her down and away just as a sharp crack split the air, the sound of a suppressed shot embedding into the wall where she had been standing. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Seo-yeon felt the world tilt, the sudden force of his grip anchoring her against his chest. The scent of his suit, faint cedar and something deeper, filled her senses, grounding her even as chaos erupted around them. Guards surged forward. The attacker was tackled before he could move again, voices rising, orders snapping through the air like whips. But Tae-jin didn't hear any of it. His focus was entirely on the girl in his arms. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. Not commanding, not distant, urgent. She shook her head, her breath unsteady, but her gaze calm. I'm okay. Only then did he realize how tightly he was holding her. He released her slowly, as if letting go of something fragile he hadn't known he was protecting. The instinct had been immediate, unquestioned. Not the calculated reaction of a leader protecting an asset, but something far older, far deeper. Around them, the room buzzed with confusion and fear, but the moment between them felt strangely insulated, suspended outside the noise. Tae-jin studied her face, searching for an explanation he couldn't articulate. Why her? Why without hesitation? Why did the thought of harm reaching her feel impossible to accept? Seo-yeon met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, something passed between them. Not recognition, not memory, but a quiet certainty neither of them could name. He straightened, the mask of control settling back into place, though it felt thinner now, less certain. Take her somewhere safe, he ordered the guards. As they led her away, Seo-yeon glanced back once, and Tae-jin remained where he stood, the echo of that instinct still reverberating through him, louder than the chaos surrounding him. Because for the first time, protecting someone had felt less like a decision and more like a memory. The night after the shooting carried a silence that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were waiting to see what Tae-jin would do next. He stood alone in the study, the soft amber glow of a single lamp cutting through the darkness. The events of the evening replayed in fragments, the gunshot, the instinctive movement, the unmistakable surge of something he had never felt before. Fear that wasn't for himself. A quiet knock sounded. Come in, he said, though he already knew who it would be. Jang Myung-rok entered without hesitation, closing the door behind him with the quiet finality of a man who had decided something long before arriving. His expression was calm, but there was a heaviness beneath it, the kind that precedes truths no one wants to hear. You handled tonight well, Myung-rok said. Tae-jin didn't respond. He remained by the desk, hands resting lightly on its surface, eyes fixed on the older man with a stillness that felt sharper than anger. Why was she targeted? He asked. A pause. Myung-rok's gaze lingered, measuring, as if deciding how much of the truth Tae-jin was ready to carry. Because she was never meant to come this close, he said quietly. The words settled like dust in the air. What does that mean? Tae-jin's voice was steady, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Myung-rok exhaled slowly, the sound almost weary. There are things I hoped you would never need to know. Tae-jin's jaw tightened. Then you shouldn't have come. For the first time in years, something flickered across Myung-rok's face. Not fear, not regret, but a trace of inevitability. The night your parents died, he began, was not chaos. It was a necessity. The room seemed to contract around the words. You were too young to understand the world they lived in, he continued. Kindness does not survive where power is contested. They would have been destroyed eventually. I simply ensured you would not be. Tae-jin's breath slowed, controlled, but his gaze sharpened. And her? Myung-rok's silence was answered before he spoke. She was the part of you that could never rule, he said. Your softness, your attachment. I knew if you kept her, you would never become what you needed to be. The truth struck harder than any accusation. So you took her, Tae-jin said, his voice barely above a whisper. I separated you, Myung-rok corrected gently. so you could grow without hesitation, without weakness. Everything you've built, every victory, came from that decision. The words hung in the air, offering justification where none could exist. Tae-jin felt the ground beneath his certainty shift, the foundation of his life revealing cracks he had never seen before. Every lesson, every success, every moment he believed he had chosen his own path now carried the weight of design. She was never supposed to return, Myung-rok added softly. But fate has a way of undoing careful plans. Silence filled the room, thick, suffocating, undeniable. Tae-jin stepped back, the distance between them suddenly vast. "All this time," he said, the words trailing off, not from lack of understanding, but from the overwhelming clarity of it. Myung-rok watched him, with something almost resembling pride, as though this moment, this fracture, was simply another step in the shaping he had begun years ago. "You are who you are because of me," he said quietly. Tae-jin didn't answer, because for the first time he wasn't sure whether that was a gift or the greatest theft of his life. Outside, the wind rose against the windows, a low, restless sound, and as the silence stretched between them, and one question settled into the space where certainty once lived. If his life had been built on someone else's design, what would it mean to tear it down? The night felt heavier than any Tae-jin could remember, not because of the storm gathering over the city, nor the restless hum of his empire continuing beyond the walls, but because for the first time, power felt like a question instead of an answer. The study still carried the echo of Jang Myung-rok's confession. Every word lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Tae-jin stood by the window, the glass cool beneath his fingertips, watching the city lights tremble under distant thunder. For years, he had believed control meant certainty, that every decision, every victory, had been earned through precision and will. But now, the truth unraveled that belief, thread by thread. His life hadn't been built. It had been arranged. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Seo-yeon stepped inside. She hesitated near the threshold, as if crossing it required permission no one had given. The dim light softened the edges of her silhouette, but the calm in her posture remained unchanged, steady, even now. "I heard voices earlier," she said softly. "I didn't mean to listen." Tae-jin turned, meeting her gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. The space between them carried too much. Fragments of memory, the weight of revelations, the fragile outline of something neither fully understood. "You don't have to stay here," he said finally. "What comes next? It won't be safe." Her expression didn't waver. "I'm not afraid." The simplicity of the answer struck him deeper than any plea could have. She had no reason to trust him, not truly. Yet there she stood, grounded in a certainty he had spent his life trying to construct. "You should be," he said quietly. She stepped closer, the faint sound of her footsteps steady against the silence. "You're not the man he made you," she replied. "Not completely." The words settled into him with unexpected weight. For so long, he had believed strength meant distance, that attachment was a liability. But standing in front of her, the truth felt undeniable. The life he had built to survive was the very thing that had kept him from living. Tae-jin exhaled slowly, the decision forming not in his mind, but somewhere deeper, a place untouched by strategy. "Everything I have," he said, "exists because of him. Every ally, every enemy. If I tear him down, it won't just be his fall. It will be mine too." Seo-yeon didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried the quiet clarity he had come to recognize. Then maybe falling isn't the worst thing. The words lingered, simple and impossible to ignore. Outside, lightning traced the horizon, illuminating the city in brief, stark flashes. Tae-jin felt the last threads of hesitation loosen, the realization settling fully into place. Power had always been his shield, but it had never been his truth. He crossed the room to the desk, opening a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a small recorder, something he had kept as insurance, a way to capture secrets others might one day need. Tonight, it felt less like a weapon and more like a key. He pressed the button. The soft click sounded louder than any gunshot he'd heard. "What are you doing?" Seo-yeon asked. "Ending a story that was written for me," he said. He began speaking, not to her, not even to himself, but to the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Names, dates, decisions. The empire laid bare in a voice steady, not because it lacked fear, but because it finally understood what mattered. When he finished, the room felt different, lighter, though nothing around them had changed. Seo-yeon watched him, her expression calm, but her eyes carried something deeper now. Not uncertainty, but recognition. "You're choosing?" she said. He nodded. "Yes," Tae-jin replied, for the first time. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain cascading against the windows in a relentless rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to rise, faint at first, then growing closer, as if the city itself had sensed the shift. Tae-jin set the recorder down, his gaze steady. "Tomorrow," he said, "everything changes." Seo-yeon stepped beside him, the quiet presence that had once felt unfamiliar now grounding him in a way nothing else could. Neither spoke as they watched the rain fall, because both of them understood the same unspoken truth. When morning came, the empire would no longer belong to the man who built it, and the world would finally see what remained when power was no longer the shield. Morning arrived without ceremony, no dramatic sunrise, no sudden stillness, just the quiet grey light of a city waking to a reality it didn't yet understand. Beyond the tall windows of the Haneul estate, sirens faded into the distance, their echoes dissolving into the hum of traffic and the steady rhythm of life continuing, as it always did, no matter who rose or fell. Inside, the house felt different, not empty, not broken, just released. The tension that had once lived in every corner, every measured step, every careful word had thinned, like a storm that had finally spent itself. Tae-jin stood in the courtyard, his jacket draped loosely over his shoulders. The air carried the faint scent of rain from the night before, cool and clean against his skin. For the first time in years, there was no schedule pressing at his thoughts, no decisions waiting in line, only the quiet awareness of something unfamiliar, stillness that didn't feel like waiting. Behind him, the door opened softly. Seo-yeon stepped outside, the morning light catching in her hair. She paused, as if taking in the same shift he felt, the subtle difference in the air, the absence of something neither of them had known how to name until it was gone. "They came early," she said gently. He nodded. They had to. The truth had travelled fast. The recorder, the names, the confessions that unravelled years of carefully constructed power. His empire, once a fortress, had dissolved almost quietly, as if it had always known its foundation was temporary. He expected regret. Instead, he felt something lighter than he had imagined possible. Seo-yeon walked closer, stopping beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt full, like a space finally given permission to exist. What will you do now? She asked. Tae-jin looked ahead, the city stretching out beyond the walls. I don't know, he admitted. I've spent my whole life knowing exactly where to stand. It's strange, not having to. She smiled faintly, the expression soft but steady. Maybe not knowing is the beginning. He glanced at her, something in her words settling deep, like a truth that didn't need explanation. For a while, they simply stood there, the quiet wrapping around them like a shared breath. The world beyond the estate carried on, cars passing, distant voices rising and falling. But here, time felt slower, gentler. Seo-yeon's gaze drifted to his hands, resting loosely at his sides. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if something just out of reach had brushed the edge of her thoughts. I used to dream about a boy, she said quietly. When I was younger, I could never see his face clearly, but I remember how safe I felt when he was near. Tae-jin listened, the words stirring a faint ache he didn't fully understand, a memory he had chased for so long without knowing what it meant. He always called me something, she continued, her voice soft, almost uncertain. A name I never remembered when I woke up. The air seemed to hold still. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when listening for something deeper than sound. For a moment, her expression shifted. Not confusion, not realization, but recognition blooming slowly, like a memory rising from beneath water. And then, she whispered it. Little moon. The words landed gently, but the effect was immediate. Tae-jin's breath caught, not sharply, not dramatically, but as if something inside him had finally found the space to break open. The name echoed through him, unlocking a door he hadn't known was closed. A small hand in his. Laughter in a sunlit room. The warmth of belonging before the world had intervened. He turned toward her fully, his composure, the carefully built armor he had worn for years, slipping without resistance. You remember, he said, his voice unsteady for the first time. Seo-yeon's eyes softened, though she didn't fully understand why tears had begun to gather in them. I don't know how, she admitted. It just felt right. The simplicity of it broke something in him completely, not painfully, but with the quiet release of a truth finally allowed to exist. For years, he had believed power meant standing alone, that survival required distance, that strength meant silence. But standing there now, with the echo of that forgotten name filling the space between them, he understood what had always been missing. He had never been alone. Tae-jin let out a slow breath, the weight he had carried for so long dissolving into something softer, something real. The city beyond the walls felt less like a territory and more like a world he could finally step into without armor. Seo-yeon reached out hesitantly, her hand brushing against his sleeve. Not as a servant, not as a stranger, but simply as someone who no longer needed to remain unseen. And as the morning light grew brighter, washing the courtyard in quiet gold, Tae-jin realized the truth he had spent his life searching for wasn't in power, or control, or the empire he had lost. It was in the name that had found its way back to him, and the life waiting just beyond the moment where the past finally let go. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile. Small, unguarded, real. And somewhere beyond the gates, the world continued, unaware that a story built on loss had quietly rewritten itself into something else entirely, something that had never been about power, but about finding the part of yourself that was never truly gone.